Greetings, Stoic Gamers. Michael Bolton, all on my own today. So I'm going to be rambling a little bit. I'm going to be talking about list building, how we get to where we get, and why we don't always get to where we want to be. I've spent the last hour messing about with Spotify, podcasting software and all the rest of it because I completely lost myself. It kept on asking me to set up a new podcast, and I didn't want a new podcast. I wanted to access my old ones. There was nearly 6 months worth of podcasts on which I couldn't find. So I had a little bit of a breakdown and threw my microphone and laptop on the floor, went off, had a cup of tea, came back, inserted the correct passwords, and here I am. Everything's working again. I'm going to talk through how I arrived at this list, and I'm going to talk through how I think most players arrive at lists. This isn't a guide on how to do things. This is perhaps a wary tale so that people can avoid the sort of pitfalls that I've fallen into on regular occasions. And it also asks a few questions. How do we decide what list we're going to take? Well, the first thing we have to do is decide what faction we're going to take. I've got three factions that I could take, that I've got models for. I could take Necrons, I can take Chaos Space Marines, I can take Guard or Astra Militarum as they are now, and I could probably cobble together a Thousand Suns list. Faction decided, I'm going to take Necrons. I've been playing them for the last 3 or 4 years. That's what I'm going to take. Next step, how competitive do I want to be? Now, this is an interesting one because if you want to compete at the top tables, don't even bother thinking about a list. Go and see what the winningest, as the Americans say, players are using with your particular faction and use it. Copy it, paste it, use it. There's no intelligence involved in putting the list together. The skill therefore comes about then learning how the list works and how to play it against a variety of all comers. I think a lot of us like putting together lists. We like scanning through codexes, and we like doing a little bit of research, and we like putting together the points so they get as near to 2,000 as we can. And I'm sure that everybody's had that satisfying moment when you type everything into your spreadsheet or onto your app and it comes out bang on 2,000, and you think the stars have aligned, the gods are all in agreement, this must be the list for me. Now that doesn't necessarily work, but it makes you feel better, and I've done it many times simply because I felt something uncomfortable about having 1993 points in my list. How am I going to use that extra 7 points? And it's just really annoying. So that's what I do. So if you are expecting a podium place, just go and copy somebody else's list that's already getting a podium place. But that leads us to another issue. If you have chosen a faction and you can't find anywhere on the interweb a competition that it's won, then if you expect to win with it, just forget it, because someone else would have won with that faction. If the faction's not winning, it's never going to win. So if you want to get onto the podiums and win top 3, top 10 even, you've got to pick the right faction. So the research involved in that is have a look at who's winning what. At the moment, the meta is in a bit of a state of flux, but Aldaria is still at the top. Chaos Marines are getting better. Voton, Grey Knights are all sort of starting to creep up, and it's starting to get reasonably well balanced. There's still a few outliers, but reasonably well balanced. So most factions will stand a chance, but pick a list from a winning player if you want to win. Now, that's not the only way to play, of course. You could just develop a list because it's fun. You've got the models, you like the models, you're going to use it. That's fine. That's fine too. But in that case, don't expect to win or come in the top 10. You can probably still win 2 or 3 games if you know what you're doing and you haven't completely taken all of the wrong units, but that's unlikely because you'll be taking some of the units you like, and the reason you like them is because they're effective. The other kind of list you might take is a themed list. I've seen this done, and I've tried it in the past where I used to use guard, and I took a plasma guard army. Everything had plasma guns where they could, and that's quite fun. Again, I'm not entirely sure it's extremely effective, unless in a particular edition something like plasma is underpriced and over effective, and at the moment it's pretty good. So I wouldn't be too put off by going for a themed list. You can theme it around anything you like, and I've seen players theme an armored fist, for example, for Astra Militarum, so everything is in vehicles. It's a great looking thing. For Necrons, there's no reason why you couldn't put together a destroyer list. All of the different factions within Orcs or Aldari all lay themselves open for a themed list if that's what you want to do. Samhain is are they the speedy ones? I can't remember, the ones on the bikes, whatever. You can always do that, but don't imagine, unless there are very specific circumstances, that you're going to win or come in top 10 in a competition if you do that. So if you want to become top 10, pick a faction that's already winning, tick. Secondly, copy somebody else's list that's already winning, tick. You can now go away and not listen to the rest of this podcast if that's what you want to do. But there is usually a compromise between what you think is going to work and what you want to use. I've got units in my Necron list that I want to use. I want to use them because I like the models, because I like the lore behind it, because I think it's good fun. And I do it because out of curiosity, I want to be coming up against some of the best players, and they're going to look at my list and go, crikey, I've never seen that on the field before, or that's not very optimal. Why is he bringing that? And sometimes you can develop a skew list that is a bit scissor, paper, stone, and we'll get onto that a bit later on. And that can cause some of the meta lists a bit of a problem. So let's say I've got my curiosity list. Let's say, for example, I'm taking my Necron list, which has the Silent King in it. You don't see the Silent King very often anymore for a number of reasons. One of them being he's expensive, although he's a bit cheaper than he was. But I like to put him in. So if you're going to do that, well, what's going to be in your list? I'm going to have a skewed list around the Silent King, and I have to build around the Silent King. But if we take a step back, in any list, let's look at what needs to be in it. I think you've got four elements that you have to put in, 4 components. The first ones are units that will trade well. What do I mean by trade well? I mean units that will kill more of the opponent's army before they die. So if you've got a unit that's cost 100 points and it pops out from behind a wall, shoots and kills something that's worth 200 points, and then dies to the slap back, yeah, okay, that trades really well. It's not just shooting and killing, it's jumping on objectives. You've got something that can jump on objective and steal an objective because its OC is higher from whatever's already on there. Great. If it dies next turn, doesn't matter. You've scored your missions. Fantastic. Which brings us on to the next component, which is units that score missions. There are hundreds of these across all the codexes, and they're the little things that allow you to get behind enemy lines or deploy teleport homers or whatever it is, cleanse, things that can do actions after they've moved because they still have the ability to shoot. These are kind of things you have to have in your army. So at the moment, we've got units that trade well, and we've got units that score well. What else? Well, there are units that buff other units. So the Silent King, for example, he's one of those. He does a little bit of trading, although not very much because he doesn't want to die, so he's not going to trade. But what he does do is he buffs units within 6 inches of him. He can give them things like +1 to reroll 1s to hit and reroll 1s to wound, as well as other things. So he's a good one. You see Farseers and you see Tau characters. I forget what they're called, but they're getting extra command points at the beginning of every turn on a 4-up or whatever it is. Buffing units, really, really important. In the old days, Chaos Lords with re-rolling ones were everywhere. Got to take them. Really good bits of kit. And then finally, I think you've got units that you like. Now, that can be because you spent hours painting them, tick. That can be because they've been effective against your Uncle Jeffrey, who can't see straight, but he enjoys rolling some dice, check, doesn't matter. Whatever, you like them, okay? So once you've got an idea of those 4 components in your head, you need a balance of all of those. So you've got a balance of an army that can trade well, that can score its missions well, and that might be by being resilient as well as killing things. You've also got units that will buff characters. In Necrons, for example, the Canoptic Reanimator is 105 points, does bugger all, but what it does do is it buffs all of your units within 12 inches because it gives you an extra reanimation every turn. Well, not even every turn, every time you reanimate, so it can be more than once a turn. It's a fantastic buffing unit. And then finally, you need the units that you like. You then have to balance those so that you can take on all comers when you go to a competition. Or do you? So you've got your army all built. It's got some units that trade well. It's got units that score the missions by being resilient or fast or being able to do actions. It's got some units that buff the units that do all of those things we've talked about. And you've got a couple of units that you like, just for shiggles. Okay, so you've now taken that away, you've thought about it, and we've put together an army that is balanced. And it needs to be balanced. Why does it need to be balanced? Because if you go to a competition or a tournament and there are, I don't know, 60, 80, 100, 200 players there, you have to be able to face, I don't know, there will be 30 to 40 different factions and more permutations of list types within those factions than you can shake a stick at. So let's say there's 30 or 40, ranging from all of the different Alderi sub-factions, all of the different Chaos Space sub-factions, Alpha Legion, etc., all of the Necron builds, all of the Orc clans. There's a lot. No problem, you think? I've got a nice balanced list. But if you win your first game and you get into the top 10, the armies that you're likely to meet in the top 10 are no longer going to be 30 or 40 factions. They're going to be from between 4 and 7 factions, and within those 2 army builds per faction. Taking a step back, if you think you're going to be in that top 10, you don't have to build an all-comers army. You need to build an army that can beat one of perhaps 5 or 6 factions and a couple of army builds within them. Now that changes the whole dynamic of how you build your army lists, because then you go right back to the beginning and you say to yourself, I don't even need to build an army list that is going to fight some obscure list from, I don't know, from an orc clan. You don't need to. You just need to build lists that will beat the top players. Now, nobody does that unless you are a top player, because if you're a very good player, you know you're going to win your first couple of games. And you know, whatever army you'll take, if you're a skilled player, you're going to be fighting one of half a dozen lists. That's it. It really is as simple as that. Unless there are extenuating circumstances like a new codex or a new set of rules or a new brain fart from Games Workshop who do something crazy. But essentially, that's how it works. What that means is you can either stick with your all-comers list and probably end up fighting really nice games in the midfield against other all-comers lists, or you can go for one of the top lists and hope you win your first couple of games so that you will be fighting the kind of list that it is designed to fight. Or you could do something completely mad and go for a skew list. Now, what's a skew list? A skew list is basically where you look at things and you say, right, I'm going to turn my list into a scissor, paper, stone list. My list, I already know, will get beaten by this third of the armies I'm likely to face, but it will beat face against the other 2/3. And then you play it hoping that you're going to fight those 2/3 of the factions that you've designed it to beat. Now, there's lots of these kind of skew lists out there, and they change all the time depending upon the meta. But it's an option. You're likely to go to a competition of 5 games and win 4-1, 3-2, 4-1 with a skew list. Nobody will know how to play it. And if you do get into the top 10, nobody will have designed a list to fight it. Nobody will have a faintest idea how to deal with it. You'll probably get beaten because the top 10 players are going to be the top 10 players no matter what the meta, because they are the best players in the country or in your neighborhood, in your area. So you could do that. What else influences what we take in our lists? Well, something as prosaic and dull as what models you have in your cupboard. Now, I turn to one side and I look at my cupboard of joy over here, and I've got quite a lot of stuff in there in the shelves up and down the wall, but I know I haven't got everything. So what you have determines what your list looks like. Racks, or they need God knows how many 100 cultists for their new cultist Chaos Marine list. They don't have to paint them anymore. They'll get somebody else to paint them for them because they're a professional player, and they either have someone who can do it for them, or they employ someone, or they will just sub it out. So within days of them developing a list, they can have a skew list or a list that is exploiting the latest rules. In the old days, the chances are that the good players were also the people who painted their armies and did all of the lore around them and loved them to bits. Chances are that it would take them weeks to get them painted. And that put a brake on things, because by the time they got them painted, there were other armies that were getting better. And so there was always that kind of sea anchor to anybody running too far ahead. Now, that doesn't happen anymore, because as soon as a new rule set comes out, people who are professional have all the time in the world. They don't have to go and be a dentist for most of the day, or they don't have to go and run a bank or whatever job they have, or run their own business. They can just paint them and then they can write it all off against tax because they are a professional gamer. Well, fantastic. So that used to be a break. It isn't anymore. And so using what you have tends to be the domain of the casual gamer, who is basically going to be in the mid tables. If you are not a semi-professional gamer, you're likely not to be winning events. So use what you have, because you're never going to be able to keep up with the meta. You're never going to be able to you won't win that race. You look at your cupboard, you decide what you've got. You know you're not going to be able to have 150 racks. But what you could have is, I've got that fantastic model. I really like it. I'm going to use it. So I whip out my Silent King. Oh, he's lovely. I'm going to use him. But then you find yourself on a path decisive route. You are on a path and you can't get off it, because if you take a unit that's worth 450 points or 420 points at the moment, then you need to support it. So you need to give it the things that will allow it to do the support that will allow it to do its job. Or you need to give it units that it will buff, so they will get better at doing what they will do, and they will trade better, or they will score missions better. And if you're going to do that, all of a sudden your list is driven by the model or models that you like, and that may well take you away from either the balanced take on everything list, or the skew list, or the top 10 list that everybody else is using in the top 10. So that will probably put you in a position where you will win 3 of your games if you know what you're doing with it. So it's not just about deciding that you want to win and taking the best units. It's also about what you've got, what the propensity you have to paint models and build them, the time you have to do it, the money you have to spend on it. The tournaments I go to now, the vast majority is still casual leisure gamers, and most of us don't care about winning 2 or 3. I win 2 or 3. I'm happy with that. 3 I'd be very happy with. And I fancy myself as a reasonable player. But if I want to really do well, I need to take the personality out of it. I need to copy the factions that are winning, and I haven't got them. If the Eldari are winning, I haven't got an Eldari army, and I can't afford to either buy one, I can't afford the time to paint one, and by the time I've painted it, it will no longer be a good army. You're never going to win unless you have the right army. So if you want to win, get the right army. Okay, why do competitive players succeed, and why are they always the same players at the top? Now, we've touched on this. I've talked about why I think that it's often the same players who stay at the top. But hold on there. I need to go and take a bath in freezing cold water before I get really overexcited. I'll be back in a second. Given all that I've said, why is it then that the same players are always at the podium collecting gongs at virtually every tournament I go to? And, you know, I can name them, and they're all great guys, and they all are really great players. So what I'm about to say does not in the slightest take away anything from that. It's not disparaging, and I don't want them to think that. What it is, however, is a mindset. It's not just about being a good player. It's not just about knowing your codex inside out and having lots of reps and practice games. What happens is competitive players succeed because when they play the game, they minimize and manage the risk. They therefore practice not losing. Okay, very different to winning. Not losing is about risk management. It's about minimizing the amount of risk. And they practice the same skills when they're building their army list. So when they're building their army list, they take the personality out of it. They don't bother about their favorite models. They don't bother about what models they have on their shelves, because they're just going to buy new ones because they can get them painted instantly or printed, 3D printed miraculously, and have them on the table within days, hours. What they do, therefore, is they take the risk out of it. There's no consideration to anything other than the models that will deliver trading, scoring, and buff the models that need it. There's nothing to do with whether they like to play with those models. There's no issue about it. It's a case of how effective they are. So their eye is always on probability of success, and their choices are built around reducing risk. So most competitive lists are built not to lose. They're not built to win. They're built not to lose. Happy to hear anybody else's thoughts. You know how to do that. If you're listening to this on YouTube, put a comment. If you're listening to it on Spotify, leave me a voice message. They're built not to lose because there is less risk in not losing than there is in winning. Okay, now think about that for a minute. What I'm saying is it's easier to build an army that won't lose. There's less risk involved than there is to build an army that will win against everything. If that's the case, I'm not sure I want to be involved in that. I look at the recent, for anybody who's interested, the recent Rugby World Cup has been on over the last 3 or 4 weeks. Well, 8 weeks, I think. The teams that win are the ones that practice not losing. And for me, that doesn't make for the best rugby. The best rugby was played by the teams that wanted to win, which was the Samoans and the Tonga and the Fiji. And from a spectator's point of view, and I suspect from a player's point of view, it was great. But they didn't win because they had not planned not to lose. You need to think about that carefully. And I am expecting a barrage of people to come back to me and tell me I'm talking complete pants. But I'm pretty sure I'm right. On the middle tables, there are a lot of people who want to win. The games are more often, not always, often more flowing, often more random, often riskier. Players take risks, rely on luck, whereas at the top table, because we're reducing risk at the top table, there is a mitigation against bad dice wherever they can. In the mid tables, hell no, we'll go for that 11-inch charge. It doesn't make any difference because we're not interested in not losing. We're interested in winning. And that mindset needs to change. If you want to win a tournament, don't go expecting to win, just don't lose, and you will win that tournament. So on the middle tables, there are players that build lists like I do, and it's a different story. So I have now come full circle to where I believe there is a different meta in the bulk of the tables compared to the top. And that's an issue because what happens is competitive players know they're going to be in the top. They build armies to fight the other armies that are going to be in the top 10, which is only going to be 5 or 6 different armies. When they get there, they're good enough players to get into the top 10 and they win the competition. The vast majority of us interweb dwellers look at their list. We go, oh, yes, we'll build that. We build them. And then when we go, well, actually, we're rubbish. We're still winning 2 or 3 games. We're still in the middle, even though we're using that great list. It must be down to us not being good players. There is a tension here between good players winning with whatever they take, which is I've seen happen. But similarly, I wonder whether some of the better players take top tier lists, do not win their first 1 or 2 games for whatever reason, or don't win their first game, and end up in the middle tables fighting people who they don't expect to fight. So their list doesn't work as expected. Whereas the people that have won their first game straight into the top tables where they know what they're going to fight. In a few weeks' time, I've spoken to Innes Wilson, who is part of the Stat Check team. If you haven't looked at their website, look it up, Stat Check. And it lists an up-to-date statistical analysis of winning factions, losing factions, player status, all of that kind of stuff. I'm going to have a chat with Innes, and he's very kindly agreed to have a chat with me about whether I'm right, whether my thesis stands up to a little bit of scientific interrogation, that there is a different meta in the top 10% of players, shall we say, compared to the other 90%. And if there is, how does that affect competitions? Is it fair? Is it fair? Because essentially you could argue that the top players create their own environment in the top 10 or 15% of games and then prevent any other players entering it, because when they go to it, they're good enough to get into that top 10 straight off. And then anybody with any other kind of list isn't going to get into it. So everybody else tries to replicate those top players' lists, which they cannot get into the top with because they're not good enough. And then they find themselves in the middle, which is a different meta, getting beaten. Now, I could be talking complete codswallop, but I think there's something in it. I'm not sure, but I think there's something in it. So Could that, for example, lead to a different way of doing competitions? Why are we still doing Swiss chess? Why do we still play games where if you win the first one, you fight someone else who's won their first game? What does that tell you? After one game, nothing. It's supposed to put people who are equally good against each other. Well, does it? Question? Come back to me. Let me know what you think. Is there a better way to run tournaments? Is knockout any better? I don't think so. Is league any better? 3 points for a win, 2 points for a draw. You tell me. Are random, you score, but you get random draws. So even if you're the best player in the world, you could still fight somebody on the bottom tables, and they might either be not very good, they might either be unlucky because they lost the first game, or they might have an army that you are not expecting. And that could put a real dent in your winning streak. Okay, I've rambled a bit. Next week, we're going to talk about my preparation for going to Cross Swords in Plymouth. I'm going to be taking Necrons, but if any of you follow me on Instagram, I've also been painting up some Chaos Space Marine Vindicators because I quite fancy Chosen Vindicators, Land Raiders, and Obliterators as a combo. Although I don't really know enough about Chaos Space Marines at the moment, so I completely confused about what marks to give them, but I'll work it out. But I quite like the idea. Until we get a chance to talk about Cross Swords, and until I tell you what I'm going to put in my list, which will include at least one Forge World model for a Necron list, if you've enjoyed what you've heard, or you've got any comments, or you hate what you've heard, find a way to get back to me. YouTube comment, voice message on Spotify. Let me know your thoughts. Until then, see you on the ice.